Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman. If this is your first time to the channel, welcome. This is where you will get information about education in America, everything that's going on, and some ideas for how you as a parent or an educator can, better understand it, deal with it, whatever you're looking for. We try to cover it here. Um, Please consider subscribing to the channel if you like this sort of content, and also like and share this broadcast so other people will be able to join us in the chat and ask questions. I have a wonderful guest today, Robert Pondiscio. Did I say it correctly? Please tell me I've said it correctly. Okay. And a 20-year veteran of the education field. On and off again, teacher, very prolific education writer. And he is a senior fellow and vice president for external affairs at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute.
Oh, no, I'm not. I'm at AEI. I'm at the American
Oh,
Enterprise.
that's right. Now you're at AEI. I'm sorry. You need to fix your website, sir. And he wrote a book, which I want you all to get and read. It's called How the Other Half Learns. If you're really concerned about how kids who are living in poverty, or what some people will refer to as the historically marginalized populations of the United States, how they are learning, what's the real scoop on that, and what works for them and what doesn't, this is a book you need to read. And we are going to talk a little bit about it, but obviously we're not going to go into the whole story on the air. So welcome, Robert. Thank you so much for taking this time to talk to us.
Thanks for your interest. Who canceled on you that you have to have me?
Nobody. I've been what I sent you. If you go back to like maybe January at least, or beyond November, I think I wrote you a note asking you to come on. And then Max Eden was here, your colleague from AEI. He was here. He says, "You really need to have Robert on." I said, well, maybe you could put a bug in his ear to answer his DMs.
Folded another one, but no. All kidding aside, I'm pleased and flattered that you asked. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. And as I mentioned before the show, I have followed your work for many years, reading your writings and so forth. And I just, I want to get this information to a broader audience. That's the purpose of this channel. I think most people, myself included, until I started, even though I have a master's in education myself, I sort of an opposite experience. I meant to be a teacher and was not long in the classroom. But I did end up homeschooling for a while and so forth. But I started researching at least 10 years ago when I had to put my own children into the public school. I was like, what's really going on? I remember from graduate school, Paulo Freire, I'm like, what's happening? And I realized even to this day, with all the coverage it's getting, I think because of COVID, most people don't really know what's actually going on. They have sort of a vague notion it's similar to when they were in school. And then they hear stuff in the news, but none of us knows what to believe with the news, right? So you are a little bit of a reality check for us, being that you are ear to the ground every day on this. So first, what I'd love for you to do is give us a quick rundown on how you got into this, your career, and that sort of thing, just so we have background.
Sure. Well, and let's come back to this idea about knowing what's going on in our children's school, because this is unwittingly the kind of the through line of my career, both, as a classroom teacher and since leaving the classroom full time. I mean, I kind of stumbled into the world of education reform and education policy, but I brought a teacher lens to it. And it was kind of a surprise to me, still is, the degree to which folks in the policy world kind of view what happens on the ground in schools as either all the same or beneath their interest. I mean, I joke that for years I've been the guy who says, oh yeah, teacher quality, charter schools, testing, data. Yeah, okay, fine. Can we talk about what the kids do all day? And it just sort of surprised me to find out that this was just not really something that folks in the policy and think tank world and whatnot really paid that much attention to. I mean, I'm not a genius. I just kind of was interested in this, and it kind of turned into being a bit of a niche. And I've kind of mined it like a vein of ore ever since. But I mean, since you were kind enough to ask, I mean, I'll just give you my brief background. Until almost literally 20 years ago, maybe right around this time of year, 20 years ago. Until then, I was in the media business. I was working at BusinessWeek magazine at the time. I'd been at Time magazine before that. Did radio news, hither and yon for a number of years. So I was basically, in the news business. And then there's a program in New York City called the New York City Teaching Fellows, which is an alternative certification program for, as they say, mid-career professionals. So I thought, oh, well, I'm a mid-career professional. I'm going to sign up for 2 years and go teach. I'd been involved, still am, with doing some not-for-profit board work in the South Bronx. And I thought, well, this would be kind of an interesting, I was kind of interested in what was going on in the community. So why don't I go teach in the South Bronx for 2 years? Turns out that mid-career professional meant, you'd been out of college for 20 minutes. So, I was the graybeard at almost 40. All of my fellow teachers in my cohort were, in their early 20s, had one job or some such. So that was kind of entertaining. But I mean, more earnestly, I signed up for 2 years. I stayed for 5. What was supposed to be my mid-career public service stint kind of evolved unwittingly into a second career. And I think it's because, once you do kind of get that ear to the ground, as you say, view of it, it's just hard to walk away, especially if you
Don't
have
I know it?
that I had where I described my evolution as a teacher as kind of, beginning with willing suspension of disbelief, where, I was teaching 5th grade, had not been in a 5th grade classroom since I had been a 5th grader, 30 years before that. And you're taught any number of, techniques and pedagogies and whatnot. And your first thought is, that doesn't resemble the way I remember learning how to read or going to school. But what do I know? I mean, I haven't been in school in 30 years. And then the next step is, wait a minute, I'm not sure this is working. You discover stuff on your own, at least, my case. And then you go from that willing suspension of disbelief to skepticism to, frankly, something akin to, militance and anger. Like, this is really not good for kids. And I became kind of an unwitting curriculum and pedagogy guy, mostly because I just felt like I was not, being trained. And it wasn't because I was an alternative certification guy. It was just, we just aren't giving kids like, my students in the South Bronx what they need to learn and grow and thrive. So,
Right.
again, there was never this moment where I thought, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. It just kind of evolved.
Yep. And how did you transition from that into education writing, like covering it in that respect?
Same thing. In other words, once you become, with that, what I'm calling willing suspension of disbelief to skepticism to militance, well, then you realize, hey, wait a minute, there's a whole bunch of people out there who need to know this. And I guess, not unnaturally, because I've been, in the media for my entire adult life, you see an opportunity to kind of take the lessons you've learned and share them with others. So, I mean, it's still teaching. It's just a question of who I'm teaching.
Exactly. Yeah, I didn't have the years in the classroom that you've had. I did, as I mentioned, I homeschooled my kids until they had to go into public school and sort of mid-elementary school. So not that long, but I had always been tutoring and so forth. And similar, once I started realizing what was going on, I felt like I have to tell people. I have to just be, mostly because I knew they had a different view than was reality. So I just felt like, the information girl, like, hey, did you know, this kind of thing. Plus because I gave everybody the benefit of the doubt that they must not know. I look around and say, like, surely they don't know. If they knew, they would be pressing for things to be different. Speaking of those, sorry, go ahead.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, my particular interest is literacy. I mean, just to give some background as to where I was teaching, in New York City is, obviously massive. It's the largest school district in the U.S. It's broken into community school districts. I was teaching in the South Bronx, which was community school district number 7, and 20 years ago and still now, District 7 is the lowest scoring school or lowest scoring district in the city of New York. The elementary school where I was placed, PS 277, was then, and I think still is, the lowest scoring school in District 7. So I was literally, by definition, in the lowest of the low. And I mean, I've told this story for years, but the year before I started teaching, the 4th grade class, my now 5th graders, less than or fewer than 1 in 5 of them could read on grade level.
Right.
or on the debate standards, based on the debate standards of the New York State, reading test at the time. So
Mhm.
I thought not unsensibly that I was going to have a classroom with 80% of kids who were literally non-readers, like they couldn't, what I now know to call decode. That was not the case. Every single kid I've ever taught was a decoder, some more fluent than others, but everybody could read. What they couldn't do was comprehend, and this is why I became militant, because my school was and I shouldn't say militant. That's the wrong word. This is why I became an adamant,
Adamant?
yeah,
Yeah.
a devotee or fetishist. When I was being trained by Teachers College in the Lucy Calkins reading and writing program, I was a demonstration classroom for it. Um, and what we were being taught was basically, look, the kids aren't reading above grade level because it's not about their experience. It's not engaging to them, all these kind of, reading homilies. And then I discovered this guy, E.D. Hirsch Jr., who I know you and I share a bit of a devotion to. Um, and this was the one theorist who described what I saw in my South Bronx classroom every single day: kids who could decode but not comprehend. Where the Lucy Calkins of the world were saying it's because of engagement and interest, Hirsch was saying no, it's because of background knowledge. And in other words, he was describing exactly what I was seeing. Is because the curriculum of that school was so limited, not because people are bad people, but just because it was there were other fashionable ideas about what they needed. And when I would bring up Hirsch's work, which again I kind of discovered on my own in my professional development and in grad school classes, almost invariably I'd hear some version of, oh, that's that dead white guy stuff. Nobody takes that seriously. And I would just be taken aback. I say, well, wait a minute, that's not what his work is about at all. It's about background knowledge. It's about vocabulary. It's about language proficiency. This is the guy who has diagnosed what our students need and they're not getting. And so, I mean, this is
Based on data too.
yeah. This is, I mean, just based on cognitive science, frankly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, why did this become kind of, my passion, education, and my second career? I mean, Hirsch's work has become my work. It's simply because when I became aware of how, frankly, poorly regarded or misunderstood his work was like, well, wait a minute, I've got a background in the media and communications world. I can be Hirsch's John the Baptist, because this is exactly, if we think we're going to close the achievement gap, we're not going to do it until or unless we grapple with this. So
Right.
that's how his ideas kind of became kind of my flavor and my work.
Yeah, well, I'm glad they did, because I think you're propagating them, and more people are becoming aware, if not of him personally, of the ideas. And for those who aren't necessarily familiar, one of the core ideas of his is that we need to return, we were once there, to a knowledge and content based curriculum, as opposed to what might be called a self directed or self led, student led kind of a curriculum, where the
Yeah.
students discover and do inquiry. If you've heard the word inquiry in terms of what the teachers are talking about, so that you have a little more direct instruction from the teachers, which has gone out of fashion. There used to be this, they call it actually in a derogatory way, sage on a stage
Oh
versus
yeah.
a
Yeah.
guide on the side.
Yeah.
They make it sound all touchy feely and nice, but even the guide on the side is retreated to the Chromebook in front of your face, and the guide is sitting up front on doing something else. So it's what Edie Hirsch, what I loved in the book I read, that you had provided notes for, about how to educate a citizen, is he not only explains about the science of reading and the cognition, the a comprehension issue and the knowledge, but he talks about how it's actually backwards, that they're more engaged
Oh,
if they picked the learning. Actually, every single piece of research, if you really look at the real research, not the theoretical stuff, you will see that the knowledge based schools, the kids are much happier, more engaged, more, devoted to their reading. They're more avid readers. They choose their own books. They'll read a book from start to finish, because they have, as you pointed out, more broad base of knowledge from
yeah.
which to, think about what they want to read, and then to understand it when they do read it. Some people have called it the romance of learning.
Yeah.
Without the background knowledge, which as a young child might get from your parents reading to, or just, having it direct educated to you, you you don't even know what you like. You don't
Well, I
know
mean,
what you
yeah.
want.
There's I find that the hardest thing for literate people to kind of wrap their heads around is how much assumed knowledge and vocabulary you're carrying around in your head. I mean, we are, as readers, it's like the cliche about the fish doesn't know that he's in water. We are unaware of the amount of knowledge and language, that vocabulary that we're swimming in, the verbal water that we're swimming in, so to speak.
Yes.
So I mean, I give a long talk about this, and I always say, like, if you forget nothing, if you remember nothing else I say, remember these 5 words: reading is not a skill. Because everything I was taught as a teacher is that reading is a skill. It's like, throwing a ball or riding a bike. That's how we teach it. That's how we test it. Once you learn how to ride one bike, you can ride any bike, right? You've mastered the skill of bike riding. Well, reading is not that way. Reading, you can read, and I always say, like, if you want to test this proposition, go pick up a college textbook of a subject you've never studied, or
Yes.
read, like, if you're a technical, idiot like I am, like, look at the instructions for installing a new operating system on your computer, and you will actually find or remind yourself what it feels like to read as a child. You can feel your lips moving, you follow along, you read and reread. You didn't suddenly become a bad reader. You're just reading out of your depth. But,
Right.
because we take so much of our own knowledge for granted, we forget that's what it's like for young kids who don't have a great deal of language and background knowledge. That's what
Mhm.
reading everything is like for them. I mean, so in other words, you
Exactly.
can't practice your way, to using metacognitive reading strategies or skills and strategies. That doesn't go away. You have
Mhm.
to you have to know a little bit. I mean, proficient readers know a little about a lot of things, and that's what makes them, at least in part, proficient readers. And there's no workaround for that. There's no Northwest Passage of that's going to get past knowing stuff. You have to know stuff.
Exactly. And somewhere along the line, that fell out of fashion, probably back in the 60s. We started late 50s or so, and there were new pedagogies and new ideas, and so where are we now? So we know that we've moved far away from the knowledge based. Where would you say we are now if you had to describe it?
It's this is okay. This is why I'm going to spend another 20 years, right? Because every time, like Sisyphus rolls that rock up the hill, it rolls back down.
Right.
I'm out of the business of promoting the Common Core. I've got the tire tracks on my back. I'll show you. But I always feel the need to defend myself by saying, look, I'm not a standards guy. I'm a curriculum guy, and Common Core. There was a talk that I gave at the time, which I called the 57 most important words in education reform, and it referred to a passage in the Common Core supplementary materials, the 57 words of which I boiled down to basically Hirsch was right. In other words, it made the point that these standards don't mean anything unless kids have a wealth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So I said, I don't care what you think about Common Core. Read this. See what this says. Um, and for a brief shining moment, I mean, because Hirsch's kind of reputation has ebbed and flowed, and I mean, Dan Willingham, my friend, who's a cognitive scientist at University of Virginia, wrote a piece some years ago where he described Hirsch's most famous book, Cultural Literacy, as the most misunderstood education book for the last 50 years. And I think he's right. So, I mean, we rediscover Hirsch's work every couple of years. And,
Mhm.
the last time we did it in a big way was during Common Core,
Mhm.
and there was some momentum. Natalie Wexler more recently wrote a book, didn't cite Hirsch too heavily, but it was basically Hirsch, the
Mhm.
knowledge gap. Her book was, so it's out there. But then along comes, frankly, the current movement, for diversity, equity, and inclusion, for anti-racism pedagogy, and we're right back where we started in terms of no, it has to be about kids, it has to be about their lives, for different reasons, not for literacy, but for reasons of identity. So once again, if you're a Hirschian, you kind of have to remind teachers that it's not enough to give kids a steady diet of stuff that reflects their experience. I'm not just dismissive of that stuff. It's important. Um, but rightly or wrongly, whether you like it or not, there is a dominant language culture, and you have to prepare children to participate in that. It won't happen automatically. I mean, sorry, we're dwelling on Hirsch to the exclusion of all other topics here. But I mean, Hirsch's basic insight is that, look, this is how language works. Literate speakers and writers make assumptions about what their
Right.
listeners and readers know.
Right.
And language relies on that to
Right.
work. When those assumptions are correct, language is fluid and effortless. When those
Right.
assumptions are incorrect, things fall apart.
Hmm.
The analogy I've used for years is like, imagine a reading passage is like a child's game of Jenga, the block games. You can plug and imagine that every single block is a bit of background knowledge or a vocabulary word. You can pluck out some of them and it stands. Then what happens? You pull out one too many, the entire thing collapses. So if you're not mindful of that, if all you do is make kids education about the stuff that they already know and like or are interested in pursuing themselves, if you
Right.
don't consciously, intentionally help build that body of knowledge that literate people know and assume you know, well, then you're almost imposing a form of illiteracy on children.
Yeah, I agree. I do want to ask you though, you know, one of the challenges with the diversity, equity, inclusion movement, aside from, the fact that it's happening concurrently with people still doing things like 3Q and Lucy Calkins and those methods that, we say colloquially don't follow the science of reading, and a lot of parents are starting to pick up on that.
Yep.
Um, when you move, even if we could get people in education moving more towards a knowledge base, the problem seems to be that the people running education right now, teachers unions, teachers, the teacher colleges, want to emphasize dismantling that dominant knowledge. They've explicitly said
Yep.
that's dead white people stuff, that's dead white men stuff. That doesn't, we need to dismantle that. It's a system of oppression, that all the knowledge you're talking about as being the dominant cultural knowledge is stuff they actively don't want the kids to have, and they're actually not even apologetic about it anymore. They're saying it's bad for them and we need to
Yep.
remake the world in this new way. So there's that component. So what I am concerned about, and as I was reading his book, I thought, I've seen them do this before. They take something that's starting to pick up on popularity and say, we decided we're going to go with knowledge base. You've all asked us to do it. We're going to do it.
Yep.
But they decide what the knowledge is.
Who's
And
knowledge?
suddenly we have the ethnic studies curriculum and the African American curriculum, and the Raza is rising. And, George Washington's a bad man. This is the new knowledge. So it's not.
I mean, every kid, I always feel the need to somewhat defend myself here. I've literally never had a single student in front of me that was not Black or brown, low income, inner city.
Right.
Like, that's all exclusively ever taught in Harlem in the South Bronx. So I don't want to. I don't need to apologize for this, so to speak. I mean, that's what got me interested in this
Sure.
work, was the unfairness of the education that we were giving to
And
low.
that's objectively true. I mean,
Well,
that's
I
been
think
one of
that's it.
the problems I've had, is I've told people, I'm like, these inequities actually are technically real. And so it's really
They are
troubling.
just real. They are
Yeah, they're real.
full
Yeah,
stop. The question is how you diagnose those inequities and how you ameliorate them, right?
correct. Yeah.
And that's where this gets this gets controversial. Look, I don't wake up in the morning looking to pick fights.
Sure.
I've written a few things over the years that have gotten me in some hot water. I've taken to ruefully joking that the day I really do want to pick a fight and really want to get myself in hot water, I'm going to write a piece with the title "Language Doesn't Give an F What You Think." Because that's basically what this means. In other words, we cannot impose our will upon the English language. You don't have to like the fact that there is a dominant language culture, but there is a dominant language culture. Now you have to make a decision. Do you want to change the world for children, or do you want to prepare children for the world? Those are both really, really hard things to do. One of them's a lot harder than the other. And I feel like there's this kind of romantic idea, and I get it, because, again, I'm deeply caught up in the fortunes of kids of color in this country. That's my job. But we have this idea that we can, by tailoring the curriculum to their interests, that we should change the world for them as opposed to preparing them for the world. I
Mhm.
wish we could do that, but I've seen no evidence that it works.
Yeah. And I think too, we have strayed from what we used to know and take for granted, that children are children. So in other words, the social contract, the hidden, the assumptions that we used to have were that adults take care of children, and adults have the, now, not all obviously, but that it's presumed that there are people in the adult section of the world who deal with solving the complex problems that dog us, and they're always there. Okay, that it's actually borderline abusive to take problems created by adults, whether they're in the emotional realm or the physical realm, and place them at the doorstep of children and say, it's your obligation to fix this or else
Yeah.
horrible things will happen. You've written about how we're almost like marinating our kids in this negativity. There's a paragraph that you have. Do you mind if I read it? Because it's like,
Please.
it's okay. It's just one paragraph, but it's so perfectly captured this concept. You said, by any reasonable measure, the world is safer and more stable today than at any time in living memory. Where'd you go? Oh, there you are. In the living memory of most Americans. Adults are more active in children's lives today than in previous generations, but at the same time, we play a less reassuring role. This is particularly true in schools, where the curriculum and school culture seem nearly to revel in the bad and the broken, suggesting to children that they have suffered the great misfortune to have been born into a country that is racist to its core, whose founding documents were lies when written, and where democracy is hanging by a thread. Not that it matters, since we're just a few short years away from irreversible climate catastrophe, all but certain to render the world spent and burned out husk by the time they're adults.
Ouch.
So yeah, I mean, it's, you read it, you're like, yeah, that's like frighteningly accurate, right?
That was the
So
cover story of last month's Commentary magazine, and I kind of, if you're a fan of commentary as I am, John Podhoretz, is always kind of, self-mocking what they do, is saying we dwell in crushing morosity. So I kind of felt the need to raise the bar and give them some crushing
well,
morosity. But I mean,
it's
earnestly, I think it is kind of true. And
yeah.
I view that. I mean, my side hustle in education is civic education. For a couple of years, I taught a senior seminar in civics for Democracy Prep, which is a charter school in Harlem. So I'm very kind of up to speed on and interested in the world of civic education, action civics, all this stuff. And I think undeniably there is a thread there. We did it at Democracy Prep that suggests to kids, and even says it overtly, look, we're preparing you to change the world, to go out and, to be active and activist, et cetera. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I think any good education kind of teaches kids where the levers are and where to pull, how to pull them, so to speak. You want kids to leave school with a sense of interest and agency and engagement. Those are all good things. But let's tap the brakes here, right? In other words, let's make sure that we leaven the loaf and invest kids in doing that work. Let's not just, have their education constantly, a parade of horribles about how terrible everything is. The country's irredeemably racist. Climate change is going to destroy us, et cetera, et cetera. Good luck, kids. Here's the keys. Like, who wants to be part of that
Well,
world? It's
well,
just,
exactly. And also it also, in my opinion, it does two things. First, it sort of tells them, all the adults, including us, the ones teaching
we've
you and the
all
ones you're,
failed.
we all failed, we suck. So why should they respect us at all? Why should they respect any of the rules or any of the things that we've done? Because people who have left them such a broken world really don't necessarily deserve that much respect, especially when there's so much evil infused in the discussion, like irredeemably race. I mean, that's evil, right? If you really believe that's not, even if you claimed it was unintentional, how could so many millions of people walk around unintentionally being evil? That's pretty dark. And then so there's that. And the second piece is, because they don't have that knowledge, the background knowledge that you described, whether it's in science or math or history or any of that, we're telling them to be very angry about something. We're telling them to go fix it, but we haven't given them the tools. So even if you're talking to seniors in a senior seminar, I think somewhere deep down in their core, they know, like, this is huge, guys. And I'm really pissed off, but you have to fit, like, they are going to realize they don't have the tools, or the only tool they have is to tear it down, like anger, which isn't really constructive. So we're not teaching, in my
Yeah.
opinion, constructive activism, or this thought that, you know what, I'm going to get really good at math and science. I'm going to go out there and become a client scientist, and I'm going to do everything I can on the ground to deal with this. But first I need to know these things. We're not doing
Yeah,
that.
well, I think that's right. I mean, there is. I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, but there is a rich psychiatric literature that suggests your so-called primal beliefs. What your view of the world is: the world a good place or a bad place? Are people mostly good or mostly bad? Really affects your mental health and
Yeah.
your motivation. So I think we have kind of an obligation to to ensure we're not yes, be clear-eyed. No one's suggesting viewing the world through rose-colored glasses, as it
Sure.
were, but I think we have a bit of a moral obligation to get kids invested, as it were. In other words, if a kid leaves us at age 17 or 18 and they're not excited about something, college, a job opportunity, enlisting in the military, if they are not fully bought into American life and civil society and engage and excited to get on with it, well, then we failed, right?
Right.
It's serious level. Yuval Levin had a fantastic piece. I think I quoted it in that commentary piece you referenced a moment ago, where he described, and Yuval's brilliant. I'm not going to be able to paraphrase him anything other than badly, where he described kind of a new face of disorder in this country, where we're used to thinking of disorder as an excess of passions, like lives leaving the rail because we can't control our impulses toward, whether it's sex or drugs or crime or whatnot, like that's the chaos is how we're used to thinking of disorder. In his telling, and the data is persuasive here, we now have this kind of disordered passivity. I think that was his phrase. The failure to launch, as it were. Think of the cliche of the 30-year-old who's still on mom's couch, who's just not engaged with the world. So, in other words, and you can look at all the data one way or the other. You could say, oh, look, the divorce rate is down. Well, yeah, because marriage is down. Oh, look, teen pregnancy is down. Well, yes, because child rearing is down. In other words, we may be kind of missing the main point here, which is that we're just not getting our kids engaged with adult life in the way we used to. And the open question in my mind is, what's different? Is it kids or is it us that's changed? And I suspect, I can't give you data, but I suggest the answer is that we have changed as
Yeah.
parents, as adults, as people. We're just not. And it's ironic, right? Because people of our generation are used to being a lot more engaged in our children's lives than our parents were with us. I mean, I sometimes joke, like, I know I had parents. I don't
Right.
very
I was a
much.
latchkey kid and
Exactly.
had
Well,
a single
I know
parent.
they would
So
yell at me if I didn't come home, by the time the streetlights came on, but they were
yeah,
not the
exactly.
hovering presence in my life. But there was still this sense that, they're in charge, they're competent, and you end up kind of internalizing kind of their interests and values, et cetera. And it's strange, right? So as engaged as we might be now in our children's lives, we're also a little bit depressed on their behalf. I'm not sure we as adults are as bought into values in American civil society as our parents were. Something has gone missing here. I'm kind of intrigued to kind of isolate what that is.
Yeah, that's you're familiar with Jeremy Adams?
No.
He wrote a book called I think it's called Hollowed Out, and it's about today's generation and how he describes them as effectively sort of hollow.
Hmm.
And he talks about what you just said, that there doesn't seem to be, that engagement, that sense of curiosity, joy. They don't really have a sense of what's the point of any of this. And there's a lot of there's so much fixation on the negative and fleeting messages, nothing they can really hold on to, nothing that grounds them. We had, even if our parents weren't necessarily around, we may have had our friend group in the neighborhood, or we would go riding our bikes, or the things we like to do for entertainment were a little more participatory. Even if you weren't involved in sports, if you went to the movies, you physically went to the movies. Like, you got up, you left your house, you rode your bike, you did your thing. So everything involved a little more effort. And they, in addition to being infantilized and not having enough free reign to just go do their thing physically, we've got these And of course, they see us on them, they're on them. And so life, right, we do it, but they don't have the background we do of where, like, yeah, and now I put it down and go do other things. They don't have that. They just have this. And the earlier
Yeah.
they start, So I think it's a confluence of things. It's a really good book.
Oh, sure.
But, you know, yes, the adults always, create the conditions. The kids have adapted to that world that we have created. So that's all the more reason I feel like it's wrong to go into the classroom and not do everything in your power to, be excited and passionate and joyful and grateful and add to, as you said, don't put on rose colored glasses. Everything is wonderful, but just talk about the successes. So let's say, for example, you want to talk about racism in America because it was, it was until to a certain degree is, but if you instead present it in terms of the, how bad it was, the progress that was made, the success that was made, what was successful, what didn't work out so great, where do we still have problems, compare, contrast. Kids need to see progress. We seem to be like progressive phobics, as Bill Maher says, where
Well,
we
it's
don't
yeah.
want to teach our children that things have gotten better.
I mean, I suppose without getting political, you can make the case that the progressive impulse is that, and I mean, political progressive as opposed to educational progressives. There is a difference. They're kind of invested in a narrative of America as a country that is badly in need of radical transformation and reform. So if that's
It's
kind
the
of
brand.
if that's the lens through which you view American life and culture, then it should not surprise anybody that that's going to color your your teaching and pedagogy, as it were, or curriculum and pedagogy. So that's not entirely surprising.
Right.
Look, I think I made this point. I know I made this point in that commentary piece. I'm 59 years old. The idea, whenever one of my younger colleagues talks about how terrible things are, we've never been more divided, it's never been more unstable. It's like, what? Are you out of your like, kid? Pull up a chair. Let me tell you about the 60s and 70s, where I
The
mean,
1860s too.
well, yeah, I wasn't. I was not.
I
Not.
know,
I
I know, I
didn't
know.
miss by much, but I was not alive then. Within our lifetime, we had assassinations. We had 30,000 dead soldiers in Vietnam. There was a book called Days of Rage by Brian Burrow, which blew me away, no pun intended, about the Weather Underground and the FALN and the kind of the homegrown terrorist movements of the 60s and 70s. From memory, forgive me if I get this data point wrong, I think there were like 2,000 domestic bombings in a single year. I think 1971 or 1972. The idea, like, you think we're in a bad way because we yell at each other on Twitter. Goodness
No,
gracious, we
no,
were killing each other within our.
literally.
And to your point, in the 1860s, if you read Ron Chernow's recent book about Ulysses S. Grant, I'd forgotten just the depraved level of violence that we had during Reconstruction. So the idea that somehow it's never been worse is not just ahistorical, it's naive. Oh, it could get worse. Let's be clear. It could
Oh,
get a lot
for
worse.
sure.
But it
The
is
other
kind of
thing,
appalling the lack of historical knowledge that we have, and how we just kind of dramatize our own experience and saying, oh, it's never been worse. So in other words, I guess the moral of the story, to connect the dots, there's really almost no excuse for communicating to children how bad things are. Again, let's not teach kids that things are, that they live in the best of all possible worlds. It could always be better. But it's just simply not just morally wrongheaded, but historically inaccurate to suggest to them that there is something uniquely bad about the days in which they are
right.
they are living.
Or not only that, but I think we're also getting it wrong if we focus on political division, whatever. I think to your point before about apathy,
Yeah,
I mean, the one thing we could at least say in the 60s is that they're still, with the exception of the extreme extremes, I would say the average person on the street still had a set of kind of shared core values that, freedom of speech was important. I mean, you always had those people who are like, lock them up, but again, that was more extreme. Where
yeah,
I see us more divided now is in terms of the average person's animosity to the average person who isn't necessarily, a dirty haired hippie or
yeah,
a like buttoned up FBI agent. We're talking about just your neighbor who would like to punch you out because you're not wearing a mask, or you
Yeah.
voted the wrong way or whatever. That to me feels, and I don't remember, I'm only 56, but I like I don't literally remember the 60s. I remember the early 70s though. But I read a lot about it, and I just have the impression, and from talking to my dad and my grandparents and things, that as horrible as it was out there, like you're describing, Twitter played out on the street, we we just had like kind of this, no nobody was really going, as a general daily commentary, like, yep, everything about America sucks.
I
Or
don't think that's
converse,
quite accurate. I mean, there
no,
certainly was,
maybe not nobody, but
on the left during Vietnam.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you remember, or have read about the anti-war protest, there was a deep
Yes.
strain of anti-Americanism. I mean, all those underground terrorist movements were a response to a real deep antipathy to
Right.
American life and society. So
I'm
I
thinking
don't
of
think
like
it's true.
Joe Average person who isn't
Oh,
in that
I
movement.
think and I'm just thinking out loud here, so I'll reserve the
Yeah.
right to change my mind about this. But I think what
And I
is
could be wrong because, like I said, I don't remember it.
yes,
But that's, I think, the perception that people have right now is that
but if
the
I may,
animosity we have to each other.
I think the difference is, and this cuts both ways as well. There was more of a standard common culture. In other words,
Yes.
and even at 56, you were old enough to remember 3 network news anchors and Time and Newsweek, for example, where
No 24-hour stuff.
we didn't have 57 channels, let alone
No,
570 channels.
no.
We didn't have social media. So I think all of these, the strains of discontent that we have are not new, but now they are our primary sources in many instances. In other words, that for good or for ill, we had a more homogenized common culture, 50, 60 years ago. That's gone. It's never coming back. So I think these differences existed. It's just you didn't not dwell on them the way we do now unavoidably.
Right. And how did that translate into the classroom? So, in other words, everything going on in the 60s, it's happening out there. I mean, I remember duck and cover drills in the 70s, but beyond that, and we saw like a little short film about Vietnam and troops coming home because it
Yeah.
was just at the tail end of that. But beyond that, I remember, and it could be rose-colored glasses here, but I remember not knowing where my teachers stood on any of it. So in other words, all that was presented to me about things going on in current events,
Yeah.
that sort of stuff was presented almost like a news report, was presented more like, this is what's happening, kids, not commentary beyond that.
Yeah,
I think
I
that's a
think
little
that's
different
right.
too.
Although it's also possible that, then as now, we lived in our kind of, political bubble, so it would not have occurred to us, to be or to be curious uh, the politics of our teachers. I do think. I mean, I don't know this, but this is a focus group of one. I went to school, grew up on Long Island, went, to school beginning to end in a, fairly routine lower middle class suburban community,
Mhm.
fairly blue collar. So I definitely remember discussing politics with my classmates, even in elementary school, and knowing, oh, this kid's voting for McGovern, this kid's voting for Nixon, this kid's voting for Wallace, that kind of thing.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it was not a monoculture. But to your very good point, did we we did current events? Boy, do I want to bring that back as an elementary school staple. But do I ever remember any kind of like political speechifying at all on behalf of my teachers at any point, K-12? If it was there, it went over my head.
That's what I'm thinking. I'm like, I either don't remember it, and that was back in the days of desks where you're like a little desk and you're facing the teacher and there's a blackboard. So I
Yeah,
like to believe I would remember it. It wasn't going off in go on the periphery while I was doing a group project like today or on a Chromebook. We
yeah,
were sitting, we were supposed to be paying attention, or you get in trouble. So I don't think I missed it. And then even going through college during the Reagan years, where I knew it was very politicized, and we knew exactly who like the left-leaning professors were, and they weren't. Even then, there were like 3 or 4 of them that were overt. No, I mean, not that there were 3 or 4 that were left wing. There were 3 or 4 that wore it like a badge. We
I,
kind of
I,
assume
I remember the first time I met a self-proclaimed Marxist on a college campus,
right,
freshman year at SUNY Oswego. I remember thinking to myself, are you allowed to tell that to people? Like, it was just
right.
so out of my experience, out of
Right,
my
it was really
experience.
bizarre, and there were, like, a few of them,
Yeah.
and everybody knew who they were, and there was, like now the rest, I guess I walked around because I was in the Northeast, I was in Maine, and I knew what the politics around me were by the time college rolled around, and, I mean, so we supposed our professors were left-leaning or Democrats or whatever you wanna call it, but it wasn't like you said, they didn't stand up on their little stage or do their thing and be like, "Now, this is right and that is wrong, and you're a bad person if you believe otherwise." Like, that absolutely didn't happen, and even in the class, I remember having a seminar with one of the professors who was more overt about being left-leaning, and even there, he encouraged differing opinions to be voiced. What do you have to say? What, well, kind of like Donahue. It was like, what do you say? What do you say? Right. So I felt like I was still free, even in the face of someone who disagreed with me. I mean, I kind of knew we were going to disagree. There was a little bit of a chill, but nothing like today. And so I think maybe that's a little bit different.
Look,
Maybe.
this is one of those hills I'll die on in my advanced age and 20 years into education. I wrote a paper and a couple of pieces for AEI within the last year with my colleague Tracy Shara, and we made exactly this argument, which is like, and again, we can talk about CRT bans and transparency bills, et cetera. These are important, complicated things. I have some issues with them structurally. I'm not sure they're going to do what people think they're going to do. Our response to this was like, look, what we really need is a teacher code of ethics here. And I don't know this. This is my
Yeah.
assumption. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I would wager my last dollar that the vast majority of American parents, right, left, and center, would agree to this idea that, look, we want our teachers, our kids' teachers, to lean into controversial topics. We want our kids to be able to grapple with difficult conversations about history, about culture, etc. What we don't want is teachers putting their thumb on the scale. In other words, and this should be part of the teacher's bag of tricks. And maybe this is because I spent so long in the news business that even though this is a value that is in disrepair there as well, it's what I kind of came into the working world with. This idea that you have to take great care as a teacher to not privilege your own point of view, to make sure that there is legitimate, genuine viewpoint diversity. Give kids the skills and the interest to make up their own minds, and not just because I have an opinion, but why do you have that opinion? What's your view of the world that leads you to is it Locke? Is it Hobbes? Is it Montesquieu? What is it? But I mean, I just think the average American, most of us would say, yeah, look, teach whatever you want. The harder it is, the better. The more challenging it is, the better. But hey, teacher, it's not about you. It's about them. It's about their voice. I had this conversation with Jillian Ballo, who is now working in Virginia. She was the superintendent in Wyoming, and we kind of bonded over this story. We told the same story, which is. When I was teaching my civic seminar, when she was teaching in Wyoming, we took great pride in our students not knowing what our
Yeah.
politics were. And I would say to my kids, look, if you get to the end of this class and you can tell me a thing about my politics, then I failed.
Right.
And she tells this wonderful story about having a student who years after she left the classroom, when she ran as a Republican for the education commissioner or whatever the title is in Wyoming, that kid reached out to her and said, "Ha, I finally know what party you are," because she ran, as a member of
Yeah.
that party. Look, this is where I'm going to be perhaps willfully naive. I just don't think that's too high of a bar to set for this profession.
Right. I don't either, and I especially don't think even if we just start with, for example, like, not to get into politics, but the Florida bill, right? Where we're talking about elementary school students and discussions about sex and sexuality, like initiated by the teacher. So in other words, we're not talking about kid says, this is my mom and this is my other mom. And you say, oh, nice to meet you. And that's the end of the conversation. Another kid says, why does Heather have two mommies? Because that's how some families are. Let's get to our reading, right? I mean, they're talking about the teacher initiating, deep dives into the stuff. And that strikes me as one of the most uncontroversial, or should be one of the most uncontroversial things there could ever be. It's not a political issue. It shouldn't be partisan. And yet it is. And so even if we could just start there, so we're not damaging the innocence of our children. Not every child, even by the way, in middle school, is emotionally or psychologically, regardless of what their biology is, ready to handle some of the deeper, more detailed and explicit conversations around these topics. And when you factor in that they're seeing and hearing and exposed to, pornography and all kinds of things going on social media, it might just overwhelm them. And I wonder sometimes if we're, like you said, it feels like it's about the adults and not about the kids. They're not, people say the kids want this, their kids need this. And it's like, says who? How do you know? Yeah. I keep wanting to say, how do you know this to be true? It feels like projection. I don't see the data.
I don't think that's a controversial statement on your part. Look, over my shoulder behind me, there's a white binder over there on my shelf, which is my my portfolio for when I got my master's in education. This is not new. I can show you documentary evidence from 20 years ago where to get my master's, I had to demonstrate a willingness to teach for social justice. The first time I ever heard the phrase social justice was as a 40-year-old grad student. This was a disposition I needed to show in order to be licensed or to get my master's degree and to teach in the state of New York. So all of these things are not new. What's interesting to me, and I've written about this some over the years, an idea that was never presented to me either in teacher training or in 5 years as a full-time teacher, it's since come up in my writing, is there have been many court decisions that say, look, teacher, you are not a free agent. You do not have free speech. You are hired speech. That's a phrase, I can't remember which court decision is from, but there was a court decision, I think out of Chicago or Indianapolis, where a teacher got in trouble for kind of veering from the curriculum, and the decision was that teachers do not have free speech. They are hired speech. They are hired to communicate a set of the curriculum that is put in place by the district and the school board. You would think that every teacher in America would know this, right? But we have, in other words, where I'm going with this long preamble is to say we have a problem right now. The way I think of it is with the culture of education. We think we have 3.7 million teachers, most of whom think that they are, have the academic freedom, which is not a concept in K-12 education. It's a higher education concept, the ability to shut the door and do what they like. And that is simply not the case. So whenever you hear about these movements like the disrupt text movement, I wrote about this, there was, some teachers who were patting themselves on the back for, getting, I think it was Homer.
Dr. Seuss. And also they got Dr. Seuss.
Yeah, but my question is, wait a minute, what's the permission structure here? Where did you think you have the right to do that? Well, because nobody's ever told them they can't. So, I mean, I don't want to imply motives here, but I think, we need to kind of pull this back a little bit and remind ourselves that we are not, free to kind of teach what we like, that this power resides sensibly by statute with 13,000 school boards in this country. And if you don't like it, well, okay, we can disagree, but that's the system we have, and we don't have the decision to disrupt it because we don't like it.
Right. I've tried to explain that to people about the hired speech versus, free speech and where you are and who you are in that scenario. In other words, the students have they have free speech with the exception of they can't incite violence and, like everybody else, but they don't.
This is why that Florida bill that you reference is kind of, bizarre. It's like, and boy, has it ever been misunderstood.
Misrepresented.
When you point out, well, it only says grades K through 3, it only says teacher. It's still, well, it's like, well, wait, are you saying you want gender and sexuality taught in K through 3? And if not, then, I mean, look, so there may be some disagreement about this, but I think most of us would just say, well, wait a minute, why would this even come up? These are little children. But
Exactly. But somebody explained it to me last night. I maintain a locals community, and one of my members referenced someone I don't know who said this, but that we've reached a point in our culture where words to a certain degree, because we use them on social media and these little compact representations like on Twitter feeds and so forth, words are becoming symbols in unto themselves. So you think of Mark Hamill putting, gay, 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 gay. It's not about what it means. It's about symbolic representation. And so the emphasis on truth and reality. And that's another thing I meant to mention back when we were talking about things that have changed since the 60s. There you had extreme views, but the core culture was one, I would say, essentially grounded in reality. Like most people, if you said certain things statements of fact, like a woman is a woman, this was not a controversial statement. There were certain just statements of basic scientific fact that even the radical would say, yeah, that's true, or whatever. We have veered away from objective reality being prized, value, even if your thoughts about changing it are different. The recognition of what it is, now we're like all over the place. And I wonder
yeah.
if that's fueling this too.
Well, your story about this just kind of reminded me back to where we started, and my journey is kind of an accidental curriculum advocate, because I was just kind of surprised that there wasn't one when I was teaching fifth grade, but that's not exactly true. There was at least one officially sanctioned, I must deliver this curriculum that was mandated by the New York City Department of Education. Every year I had to teach a unit on sexual education. So I didn't have a math curriculum. I didn't have a literacy curriculum. Was not required to teach anything specific in science and history and geography or art or music. But I was mandated to discuss, forgive my language, unprotected anal sex with 10-year-olds. Okay. And I will
How
never
did
forget
you
that.
do that? Like, I don't think I could.
I didn't. Hand to God, fire me. I remember when the AP delivered this curriculum, I just read it. I went back to it and I said, suffice it to say, the words unprotected anal sex are never coming out of my mouth in front of 10-year-olds. That was it.
Uh,
That was it. I refused to teach it.
Thank you. I mean, I'm so glad that there's a certain number of students in New York that didn't have to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I know it's
But
happening today, but like you're telling me this is years ago. This is how many years ago?
this was 2000, circa 2002, 2003. But I mean, this is appalling for two reasons. One, I think is just inappropriate. Two, that's the only required curriculum. In other words, you are trusting me to call audibles all day, every day, teach what I like, shut the door, and make my best judgment calls about what a 10-year-old in the South Bronx needs. But this is the thing you're going to mandate that I teach? Okay. Okay.
And I can't, and like I said, now we have teachers in places like New Jersey who are instructed to teach 6-year-olds, kindergartners, that their parents assigned their gender at birth. And they can change it if they want. I mean, these are kids who might want to be like a kitten or a unicorn. So, I mean, as soon as you can convince a kid, a little 6-year-old, that a man and a woman is just a social construct, what's to stop them from thinking, I'm a unicorn, I'm a cat, I'm a whatever. I mean, my daughter wanted to be a mermaid. So once you've assaulted reality like that and injected mistrust between the parents, what's next?
Boy,
So
it's really all about trust, isn't it? I mean, I'm actually working on a massive piece right now that I'm pleased to have this time to kind of lift up my head and talk about things other than that, because I've been dwelling on this for quite some time. I mean, at the end of the day, regardless of where you are on any of these contentious issues, I think I'm on firm ground to say that what we're really living through right now is an unprecedented crisis of trust in American public education.
yeah.
And look, if we're really honest about it, we're all guilty of this. Like, I'm a choice guy. Okay. I want the students that I taught, or now their children, to have the same degree of freedom, of educational freedom and choice that I had. That said, I kind of get impatient a little bit with some of my choice advocate friends, some of whom you perhaps had on your podcast, who kind of rub their hands a little bit gleefully when things are going poorly in public education. Why? Because that's the worse things go in traditional public schools, the better it is for choice. If things are going badly there, that creates a demand for choice. I'm not naive. I get it. And then you get on the other side, the kind of extreme anti-racist social justice teachers who are no less guilty of undermining faith in American institutions. They're just doing it from within, and kind of sowing the seeds of distrust. This is not a game we're going to win, either of us. In other words, and again, I'm a choice guy, but the sun is going to go out before we're in a situation in this country, I think, where the majority of kids are in schools of choice. So it just makes no sense to me to either seek to undermine the institution of public education or to seek to undermine it from within. We are deeply invested in. I mean, yes, parents have an extra amount of skin in the game, but we all have skin in this game. We are all, or ought to be, profoundly invested in the curriculum, the culture, the signals that we send to every American child, regardless of the roof under which they go to school every day. So I worry that we are all a little too eager to undermine the trust that we have at this institution. And we kind of need to get right with this, because it just feels like a very dangerous game.
It's really challenging, because when you observe, even if you try to be objective and dispassionate about it, and you just sort of observe what's going on, and I'm wallowing in it every day looking at this stuff. So I start with the kid. So I'm always starting with, like you said, when you asked in the very beginning, what are they doing all day? That's my starting place. Is there are children relying on us adults, or parents and adult members of the society, to educate them and prepare them to be like us, okay, and to survive and thrive in the world. I'm sorry?
Maybe like you, not like me.
Well, I'm just saying, they're
Yes.
They're little kids and they have no choice but to be there. Okay. So I place that at the center of my thinking. And when I do that and I start thinking about reform, one way or the other, choice, not choice, whatever, and I look at the structure and I study how the unions work and I study how the school boards work and I study the sort of perverse incentives of this whole system that has become almost like it's almost like the Matrix. It's so big and it seems to have so many self-defense mechanisms against reform that sometimes actually come back and not only hurt parents and teachers, but hurt the students when you attempt them, because they're almost like little white blood cells that go out and be like, And so I get to feeling like, you have two choices. You can continue to fight this and try to like nip at its edges. And if you can get a giant group of people together to try to help you with it, and that'll be better. But you can try to devote your time to doing that, where you're up against 3 million strong in the NEA, 1.7 million strong in the AFT. The Department of Education at the federal level is like, who knows who's in whose pocket? It's hard to say. So you're talking about massively powerful people, some of whom have literal police power. And the ones who don't like you nudging at them have the ear of the ones with the police power. So it's daunting. Sure. And those are realities. Like, I'm not trying to be Little Miss Nelly negative or anything. This is reality. We were described as potential domestic terrorists. So you can do that. And that's fine. That's one option. Or you can just go, and that would include fighting for choice, by the way. That would include fighting for the choice in public ed. Or you can say, I disengage. I, as a parent, am going to disengage and just remove my child from this system and kind of give up on it, because my kid's got 13 years, or maybe it's at this point 5 or 3 or 2 or whatever. My little child is going every day. And that my job as a parent, first and foremost, is to get them an education and shepherd them to adulthood. I can't distract myself from that activity or leave them in the building while I spend the next year, 2 years, 3 years of their actual education that I don't like, that's not coming back. You get one childhood to do that. So where I've been struggling is, I don't disagree with you. It's not going away. I would love to restructure it and do all kinds of things to it to make it less compulsory, more choicey and all that, more knowledge-based, all the things you want. I think we would agree 100%. But I don't maybe I am, but I don't think I'm intentionally undermining trust by informing people that this is the state of the state.
Look, you said you don't want to be
certainly not trying to.
Let's try to nuance this, because I mean, you said you don't want to be negative. I don't want to give the impression I'm being complacent either. I'm merely suggesting that we are a little too eager to to cast shade on the flavors of education that we don't like. I want choice. I'm a choice guy. That does not mean axiomatically that I am anti-public schools. I am not anti-public schools. It's as simple as that. In other words, when you view all of this through the lens of advocacy and politics, there's a bit of a moral hazard there. In other words, your side benefits when the other side loses. But I'm merely suggesting it's not a zero-sum game. That we have an interest in. I mean, look, I've said this for years, but long before I understood anything that I know now about choice and charters and Milton Friedman and on and on. There was a I remember thinking I would send my students, my South Bronx students, I would send them to the Lucifer School. I would say this: they could go to the Lucifer School if they would end up being able to read and do math on grade level. And I meant it. In other words, the public's interest is in the outcome, not under the real estate, not the roof under which that happens. So it's simply, I try to maintain a values neutral approach to this. I don't care whether it's public, private, charter, homeschool, sitting under a tree with a slate. It's in all of our interests that every child learn how to read, be engaged, etc.
Of course.
And it's not as interested as others are in the good, better, best, which is the best way, etc. I want
it really should be determined by the family. It should be determined by the family and what their child needs and so forth. I mean, that's how.
I don't ever want to be the guy who says that school sucks. No kid should go to that. Like, okay, somebody's choosing that school. How do we make that school? It may not be my choice. How do we make that school better?
Right. I mean, we might be observing that it's not doing a good job, but I get your point. I have called myself a government compulsory school abolitionist, meaning that the way it is right now, where you're compelled to go to the zip code thing and here's where you go and you don't have a choice, and that type of system where it's really so compulsory in every respect, and you have to either be rich, like you said, or you have to I'm against that, because I do think that the parents should be able to find what works best for their children, even if it is a public school, right? Okay, so I just don't like the compulsory model. I will admit, as I'm sitting here talking to you, I think I've been guilty of a sort of a genetic fallacy, in the sense that because I know a lot about public school history in America and like who created it and on what grounds and what their goals were, and there's a lot of xenophobia and there's a lot of racism and stuff like that. I think I've been guilty of carrying that forward and saying, and therefore, right? Kind of how people said, and therefore America. And that's wrong. I shouldn't do that. But I do think it's important when we're looking at reform to understand the origins, to at least say, have we sufficiently changed that? In other words, have we taken a hard look, just like with the country, have we taken a hard look at our origins and the origin story of public education, and made sure that we're not accidentally perpetuating some of those things that I do believe resulted in what you saw with the inequities in the different schools? See, that's where I go back to sort of the origins, say it was kind of set up like this, guys, and if you really want to change it, you do have to come face to face with that and accept, on the school side of things, some blame. It's not all everybody outside. Inside the institution needs to take a hard look at its own structure, I think.
Oh, no question. And to bring this full circle, there's a reason that I spend most of my time dwelling on teaching and learning, as opposed to the structures, as opposed to funding and chartering and et cetera, et cetera. Because as a practical, so I'm speaking to you today. I live in upstate New York in a fairly rural community now. Choice is a meaningless construct here. Like, there is the local central school district. That's where you send your kids. Even if choices, I mean, the population base just does not exist to support choice on a meaningful
level. Are you back in Oswego?
No. I'm in a little town called Greenville, New York, about half an hour of Albany.
Okay.
People here, the school is the central hub of activity in this community. It's where your kids go to play sports. It's where the fundraisers happen, on and on and on. So it's not just a school; it's kind of a civic hub. I'm sure. I mean, I know there are some fairly, well-off people in this area who might, send their kids up to Albany Academy, which is a nice, private school about a half an hour from here. But as a practical matter, if you live here, that's where your kids go. And that's not
Right.
going to change in any meaningful way anytime soon. Um, do I not have an interest in that because I don't have kids in that school? Of course not. I mean, I'm deeply interested. This is my community. The signals that
Sure.
these children get matter deeply to me.
Mhm.
The caliber of education will materially affect this community's quality of life
Mhm.
until I'm, long under the ground.
Yeah.
So we all have a vested interest in that. Choice is just never going to be the thing that makes my local school district good, better, best, or et cetera. It's a non-starter here. That doesn't
Right.
mean that choice is not an important thing to continue to work for. But
Mhm.
I'm really making a structural point. There are some parts of this country that choice is not a meaningful construct for. And the other thing too, Deb, is that look, it's not as if we're not capable of delivering education in a different way. I'm sounding like I'm not a choice guy. I promise you, I love choice.
No, I
But I
know you
mean,
do. No, this is I'm actually
when
really appreciating this because you're educating me. Like there are things that I'm realizing I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't think about that."
yeah,
So
well,
it's really
we
good that you do.
have the ability now to deliver education in a different format.
Yeah.
We've done it for the last 2 years when people were doing school like this. So it's not as if
Sure.
we don't know how to do this. When people lament, oh, schools haven't changed in 150 years, it's not because we're hidebound. It's because we like it. Okay. We like sending our kids to this thing called a school where they sit in a room with 24 other kids and there's a teacher in the front of the room. That is an enduring cultural
I think
habit.
we just have
So
an imaginary picture of what it is still, and
well,
it's
we may
different.
sentimentalize it
Yeah.
excessively, but I
Yeah.
mean, I always point out to people, it's not like we can't disrupt this. Sometimes we just choose not to. But if that's the case,
It's a
how do we
really
make
good
it better?
point.
How do we make it more efficacious for children?
Right. And that's kind of what I was pointing to is that we need to figure out how we disrupt it um in the sense that in the sense that we shouldn't be afraid to ask for what will really work or what we think will really work, and we need to know where to go to do that, because I think a lot of people are going to school board meetings and that's not really the place to go, but where is the place to go and so
Well, I
forth.
don't know about that. I'm
It
kind of
depends on the
enjoying it.
state. You're enjoying
Yeah.
it. It is educating a lot of parents, but we could do a whole show on that. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but the point is
Oh,
that
can we please? It's a great rabbit hole.
well,
Let me-
the point I would make, I guess, is that
I was going
not
to make
every
one point real quickly. I mean,
okay,
as a
go
person
ahead.
who I've always said civic education is my side hustle, how does it make sense for me to work to encourage children to be civically engaged, raise their voice, go to meetings, yell and scream and shout, and then condemn it when people do that? No, like, no, this is what we do in this country. This is called self-government. It's hard, but this is what we do. I applaud it. It's great. I don't have
Yeah,
to
and
agree with what people are doing, but
right.
this is how we roll.
No, it's true. It's just I mean I guess I'm thinking more pragmatically in the sense of like, yes, do this. Just you got to go to
Yeah.
this body, not that body, whatever or whatever. So we've been talking a long time, and I want to get to a couple other things before. I don't want them to be done, don't want to finish without touching them. The first one is because somebody asked in the chat, you brought up a diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice emphasis, even your master's degree that you had to get. Um, right now, there's sort of one dominant way of doing it. In other words, of infusing the curriculum with the equity or the diversity inclusion. It's like the intersectional model, it's the critical theory model, and so forth. The commenter asked, what do you think of something like Chloe Valderi or theory of racelessness or some of the others? In other words, do you think there's value in direct instruction of diversity, equity, inclusion, race, etc., to the students, and we just need a different modality or a different type of way of doing it? Or do you think we should go back to the old way? What I remember, which is where it was in the curriculum, in other words, in our history lessons and our literature that we read and so forth, it wasn't in your face. It was just you would read about characters having these conflicts and you would discuss it. And so it would come out in those discussions about the liberal values and tolerance and things like that. It wasn't like, you need to do this. What's your thought?
I wrote a chapter in a forthcoming book for the Heritage Foundation, which I'm going to be really interested to see how it lands, if it gets any attention whatsoever. I mean, I've been accused of being a contrarian, and I don't try to be, but every now and then ideas just seize me. So sorry, this is going to be a hard one to describe
That's
quickly, but
okay.
there's an Australian, I think she's an Australian political scientist by the name of Karen Stenner. And a few years ago, she wrote a piece, or Jonathan Haidt wrote a piece about her work, which mostly, and I'm going to summarize a complex body of work really, really badly. She focuses on authoritarian impulses that we have,
Mm-hmm.
and to summarize Karen Stenner overly broadly, her point is that authoritarian mindsets are not fixed. That we all have what I think she described as an authoritarian button on our forehead that can get activated under certain circumstances, and what that means is that when your in group is threatened, that's when that authoritarian
Yeah.
impulse comes to the fore. She was not writing about K-12 education. That's what I do.
Yeah.
But I was fascinated by her work because it suggests to me that we're quite literally doing it wrong. In other words, if what is the noble impulse behind DEI work? We
Yeah.
want children, quite rightly, to feel safe and valued, regardless of their identity, gender, etc. We
Sure.
want that inclusive. That is not a bad thing. That's a good thing. But
Right.
what if we're doing it wrong?
Exactly.
What her work suggested to me is that when you dwell on difference, you create antagonism to difference.
Mm.
The way to create conditions where we are genuinely diverse and inclusive and mean it is, this is directly from Karen Stenner, is to valorize sameness.
Yes.
Remember when we were kids and in school, where we went to school in the last best age of the melting pot, right? And look, the melting pot fell into disabuse or abuse for lots of good reasons. Lots of folks were not allowed to melt. But that impulse, e pluribus unum, that impulse that wherever you came from, you're an American. Wouldn't it be ironic if we had it right? If that was the way to create the conditions that
Mm.
valorize diversity, and now we're completely screwing it up. I mean, I don't want to get
Yeah.
out over my skis, but I think it's an interesting thought exercise to ask the question: our intentions are good, but maybe we're actually making it worse.
Right. And I think that we are. I mean, I'll go out right. I'll go way out over my skis and I'll say it. Um, I think that we are. I mean, I think we've seen higher instances of, we've just this year seen more violence in the schools that is specifically race based. We've seen more antagonism, so called affinity groups are cropping up based on the students wanting them, which is really sad. So it seems to be going backwards. I feel like it's regressive and regressive to a place that I never lived. In other words, I mean, maybe I was kind of spoiled. I grew up in the Northeast. I grew up in New York City and I went to schools and then in New England and so forth. And we didn't have separation like that. It was, I mean, you might see more of the kids who, the black kids might sit together a little bit at lunch sometimes, but it was not exclusive. It wasn't like you couldn't go sit down. There were no affinity groups. It wasn't like that. And I just don't even know that world. That's a world I've never lived in and I don't really want to live there. So I
Yeah.
I will go out on that limb. The next question though I do want to ask you, we did talk briefly about teachers and we talked about them being hard speech and so forth. Now, you recently mentioned, I think it was on Twitter, you said one of my lingering questions, and that's kind of where I got this title, after 20 years is still kind of like, why are we still doing certain things wrong as far as educating teachers and as far as what we're putting into the classroom? That why are we, I'm curious what your other lingering questions might be. If that's one, if there's others that are more pressing, what still puzzles you? Like, why are we doing this?
Yeah, I am kind of surprised. I mean, we don't talk a lot about ed reform anymore. It was kind of like the dominant, stream of political pushes of education for the last 20 years. Now, I mean, the ed reform movement, such as it is kind of fractured and not cohesive. But
Mhm.
I've been surprised for most of the last 20 years how we've given ed schools a pass. Basically, we try to
Yeah.
fix everything in education, but we've just kind of ignored ed schools. And I mean, having been to ed school conscripted, I guess I would say, because I don't know that it added value to my teaching. It continues to kind of shock and surprise me how the average graduate of an American school of education is simply not well prepared to teach. And I think it's because of the way, the value set of ed schools. It tends more to be about your disposition. They consider, teaching classroom management, et cetera, beneath their dignity. I mean, I've made a rueful joke about this over the years, that if we trained air traffic controllers the way we train teachers, we would tell new air traffic controllers, oh, you crashed a plane? Well, that happens. You're new. It's your first year. You'll get better. We would not accept the level of failure in any other profession that we almost make a virtue of in education. Right. I mean, it's almost like a hazing ritual. We think it's kind of, this is how we earn our stripes. Right. In my perfect world, when I'm in charge of American education, and please God, never let that day come. I always point out that, like, look, when my Apple laptop breaks, I don't take it to the hardware store. I take it to the Genius Bar, because there are qualified people there who know how to work on this device. Well, why don't we train teachers that way? In other words, if I'm operating, or if I'm opening a core knowledge school or a classical education school or a Montessori school, I want to hire a teacher who understands, knows, and has been trained in those, in that pedagogy, in that curriculum. Wouldn't it make more sense if we certified teachers to teach specific, not just subjects, but specific curricula? So that, but this is redolent of, now you're treating teaching like a craft or a skill and not a profession. Guilty as charged. I guess that's exactly what I'm doing.
I mean, it certainly beats factory worker, which is what, to a certain degree, the emphasis on unions and the collective bargaining, and you can't work past 3 without overtime. And I mean, I was, in my brief tenure as a public school teacher, here's why I didn't get a permanent spot or a permanent contract, and then I just decided to leave. 2 things. 1, I kept violating union rules, apparently. I wasn't very good at remembering what I was supposed to do and not supposed to do. And I kept wanting to give to my students, and I stayed after school, and I talked to the parents of my kids whenever they wanted. And I just saw it as my calling. Like, this is what I'm supposed to do. It's a job. It's a profession. Professions don't end at 3 p.m. or whatever. Professionals work until the job is done. I did write lesson plans, even though they weren't required of me. Then I had a teacher confront me in the hallway and say, "You're making us look bad." So I did the job the way I thought was the professional way to do it, and I got nothing but grief. The second reason was I was pulled aside by my principal multiple times and informed that I was not nurturing enough. And I asked what that meant. And can you please give me an example? Because I had only glowing comments from the parents. I was teaching first grade. The kids seemed to love me. They would like run up and greet me, and so forth. So I couldn't understand what she was deciding, because she said, every time I stop by your classroom or walk past, she said, "I hear you speaking in the same voice that you speak to me." And I said, "Oh, okay, it's my voice."
Yeah.
She said, "Well, think about this other teacher." And she gave an example of another teacher who'd gone to the same graduate school. She said, "We sort of hired you because you went to the same graduate school, and look at how she speaks." And I'm thinking, that's exactly who she is, though. She's got that little sweet, sing-songy voice like this. I said, I couldn't be that person if I tried. Like, it would be so fake. And I tried politely to tell the principal, I said, if there's one thing I've learned about children, it's that they have like a detector when you're not true to yourself, when you're being fake. Yeah. They don't trust you. They're wondering what's going on. And I said, if I suddenly...
I make this point all the time. Like, in 180 days times 6 hours, you are who you are. You cannot stay in character, for that amount of time.
No.
So you have to learn to work with the personality that you have, because it's, you're not going to...
I wasn't mean. Like, she wasn't saying like, you're mean to them, or you're too harsh to them, or you're too adult to them, or you're using big words. It was just my tone. It was literally the tone of my voice. And I even asked her, I said, "Is the quality of my work off, or the results? So the kids are doing really well?" She said, "Yeah, but it's really a problem." And so when you mentioned disposition, I was like, yeah, guilty.
I'm laughing because I'd mentioned earlier that my school was a teachers college reading and writing project, Lucy Calkins' shop, and it became a cartoon to me after a while. Every staff developer and teacher from that place, they ended their sentences with question marks.
Oh my God, when it wasn't a question mark. I can't stand it.
And I wondered, did you learn how to teach this, or is this required? It's like,
I can't stand it.
It was like nails on a blackboard to me, that I felt like, am I supposed to talk like this? Never quite adopted that patois.
Add vocal fry to uptalk,
Oh my
And
Lord.
I mean, like, oh, I can't even, right? So, but
Crazy.
no, but it's so true. So I completely agree with you. The pipeline, teacher education. I think I'll be honest with you. I think that's where we actually need to focus because we've got a lot of leaving and retiring teachers. And I tell parents all the time, you can pass legislation, you can complain, you can do so many things. But at the end of the day, unless you're prepared to sue, the teacher's going to close the door and the teacher's going to do what the teacher's going to do unless the principal and the superintendent, everybody's going to enforce some kind of code of ethics. And that's
Yeah.
not like it happens. You've got literally millions and millions of teachers. You need to concern yourself with, like you said, that code of ethics on the one end, and on the other end, how are the new teachers being trained? Because if you can reform that, you win.
Yeah, I'll go one step further. I'll see you and raise you, I guess, to use a
Okay.
poker analogy. Um, and again, I think my ed reform credentials are in pretty good order. I've spent a lot of time talking about this stuff, and maybe this is because of my classroom lens. I make this point all the time. This is maybe the hill I will die on. We have 3.7 million American teachers. The law of large numbers suggests that if you have 3.7 million of anybody doing anything, you're going to have a range, from, saints and superstars and people you'd lay down in traffic to have your kid in that class, to people who maybe should be doing something different for a living. I like to invoke the late Donald Rumsfeld, who said, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you wish you had. Well, you go to
Yes, I
school
know.
with teachers you have, not the teachers you wish you had. If
Right.
everything that we do in education, policy, and reform is predicated on the notion that we are going to raise their level, that we are going to get the cognitive elite, the saints and superstars, well, God didn't make enough of those. So you have to make this job doable by the men and women that we have. And if the men and women that we have cannot do this job at a good enough level, the answer can never be change those people. The answer must be change the job, because again, the law of large numbers. If we are going to depend on nearly 4 million ordinary men and women to educate our children, it must be a job that 4 million ordinary men and women can do well.
That is really challenging. I mean, that's a tall order because you're talking about a job that they're adding to the job. They're not taking
Well,
away.
that's
So,
the whole thing, and now we're asking them to be, in addition to being,
psychologists.
we want them to be mental health counselors as well. And I point this out, and people act like I've sprouted horns. Like, why don't you do you hate children? It's like, no, I hate children having to be in schools where we ask their teachers to do too many things and none of them well. That's not the same thing as mixed school. That's not the same thing as dumbing it down. It's the same thing as recognizing that human beings have cognitive limits. And
Right.
and if you keep asking teachers to do more and not take away, Dylan William is brilliant on this. It's not like the stuff that you're taking away isn't important, but there's only so much you can do, and if you
Right.
keep asking to do more, some things are going to go badly, and it's one thing when your algebra lesson goes badly. It's another thing entirely when your mental health lesson goes badly.
Yes, because then you're really violating all the codes of ethics. I mean, you're messing around. It's a tough job to be a clinician for children in the first place when
Yeah,
you're trained.
sure.
Because they're children. And as a whole, their capacity for reason, their desire to open up to total strangers, there's just so many things in play. And when you take a teacher and there's that risk of like, are you going to tell the other students? Are you going to, like, it's just, they're not counselors. They're not trained for that. And I
Yeah.
also think, as you pointed out before, that if you're constantly taking someone's mental health temperature, you're asking them to constantly take their own mental health temperature. And one of the most important things to encourage people to do who are going through a tough time is to distract themselves and not never think about it, but find a safe place where you don't have to be mired down and thinking about whatever's troubling you. And for some kids, as you've probably noticed, if things are not so great at home, sometimes school is your safe. School is the place you go to, like, be distracted, think about other things, see your friends, focus on something else. So if somebody's constantly saying, let's talk about your parents, let's talk about what's going on at home, it could very well add to your trauma. It could very well, so they're not really respecting children's mental health if they're
Yeah.
constantly making them think about it.
And I could be wrong about this, but I'm not sure. that teachers need a whole lot of directives to be empathetic. I mean, if you are
Yeah.
not somebody who likes children, and likes being around children and is naturally concerned with their well-being, you probably get in a different line at career day. You
One
might,
would hope.
you probably get a line that says, accountant or lighthouse keeper or something like that. You're not like in the line that says elementary school teacher. So let's hope that we don't have to
Yeah.
remind teachers to be empathetic.
Well, I mean, the challenge is, and some detractors have said that for a host of reasons, which, we could, figure out pretty easily, um, ed school and becoming a teacher, in particular, an elementary school teacher, it seems to some people like an easy job, in the sense that, not easy, but what I'm saying is,
Yeah.
oh, I
No,
get
no.
my
Oh,
summers off, I get great benefits, I get a respected white collar career where people in the community are going to look at me as a hero, and they won't really know whether I'm doing a great job or not. Whatever. I mean, I'm talking very cynically. Obviously, this is a small percentage, but I'm saying that could be a draw. And I have protection of a union. I have a guaranteed this and that and the other and so forth. So that could be a draw for people who actually maybe don't like kids very much, because I've seen enough TikToks of the past 2 years of teachers who I think to myself, why are you teaching? You so obviously can't stand children.
I don't know, but I mean, you might be right. I mean, I think we've all had the experience. I remember, that's my certification is elementary ed. Can I think of teachers who I thought, wow, you really don't like kids? Sure. Are they still teaching? They are not. You learn pretty quickly, whether or not this is for you or not. Look, the other thing too is that, and sorry, I don't know why this idea popped into my head when you were speaking just now, but it did. I think we will know that we are serious about education when kind of most of our energy and most of our talent goes to early childhood ed.
Oh,
This is
100%.
we
Yes.
didn't get to this, today, and maybe we can do it another time. But I mean, we spend so much time. I used to tell my fifth graders this all the time. It's one of the things I'm sure they, 30, 20 years later, they still remember me for. I would always say, it's easier to keep up than catch up. Well, that's all we do in education, right? Is we don't keep up, and so we play catch up forever. When our most talented and energetic educators are in K1 and 2, when we are really applying ourselves to literacy in earnest, then I'll know we're serious. In other words, when
100%.
right now, when elementary education ceases being about, oh, I like being with kids all day, and no, this is intellectually serious work. This is how we get kids to the intellectual starting line of reading. Then I will know that we have turned a corner.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And I hope sometime you will come back and let's just do a whole show
Oh,
on early childhood education, because
yeah,
I could not agree more. I'm working with a group out in California called Save Math, and they're working on pushing back on the new math framework that's coming from the politicizing math and so forth. So much of the focus of that is like middle school forward. And
yep.
I watched sort of a little webinar with some of the people evaluating it, and they said, well, I'm teaching high school math. And when, 2/3 of my class is coming to me and they can't read, and, there's really nothing I can do, so if they're failing math or they're failing to go on to advanced math, or that we're way too late in the process. I can't remediate this. This isn't even about the math because of the literacy problems. And we have, some schools like in Baltimore where not a single graduate is proficient in reading or math for that matter.
Yeah.
This is a non-starter. And like you said, it happens in those early years, elementary school. People really don't understand. I think even parents don't understand how incredibly important. And if your child gets to third grade and and they're really stumbling and they just let's keep going, keep on going. It's like an assembly line. It just gets exponentially harder. And that's where you get so many of the other problems that we say we want to solve, like behavior problems, ADD, all the things often, very, very often trace back to inorganic origins
Oh, no
of.
question. Look, I've made this point. I'm semi-serious about this because I always try to think of the unintended consequences of things like this. But federal law, we test every kid in reading and math grades 3 through 8. I could convince myself that reading tests should not start in third grade. I could convince myself that they should stop in third grade. And what I mean by that is if we nail the decoding piece, if we get every kid to third grade as a fluent decoder, then the rest of their education, the old cliche, overly broad, but first you learn to read, then you read to learn. Well, right now we have too many kids who do neither. So if we could get every kid to the decoding and fluency starting line by third grade, if we did only that, man, we would have a much more effective education system.
That is great. And also probably a really good place to end it. Was there anything that you
Oh,
wanted to say as a final point or anything like that? Because
just
I mean, how do we top that?
Muriel
Between
said, let's do this again, because I mean,
definitely.
full disclosure, before we started, I said, you book 90 minutes. I can't talk for 90 minutes. I could talk for, or I
And
could
here we are.
talk with you for the entire afternoon. So let's do this
Yeah.
again.
Let's definitely do it, because I really want to go deeper into that early childhood. That is definitely my personal, like, that's where my heart is. And even though if I were to go back in the classroom right now, I would probably go into middle school. But part of why I don't is, as you point out, like, I don't really want to be a remedial person. I want to go into a middle school setting where I am teaching the readers, the kids, where I can share with them my passion for literature,
Yeah.
my passion for history, my passion for civics, these things, and really get them to dive in, be excited about this material, this content. But they have to be reading.
Yeah.
So maybe I would have to go back to first grade for a while. So because I taught my children to read, and they're avid, proficient readers. I did it all by myself. So anyway, I cannot thank you enough for taking this amount of time to talk to us. For those of you wondering, the replay will be up immediately. So, and for those listening on the replay, thank you. Um, you can find Robert on Twitter at Robert. I think you're R.
Our Pondiscio,
R.
or just
Pondiscio.
I'm not hard to find.
Okay. And I highly recommend the book too, How the Other Half Learns. Because you will really dive into sort of charter school experience. There's, some controversial stuff in there, but if you're a choice person, it's a great book. So thank you everybody for coming. Thank you so much, Robert. And we will do this again. Have a great
Thanks.
afternoon, everyone.
Bye.